The idea of people having children is something that is generally regarded as something good or wonderful even. In a sense, it is the ultimate goal we have as people. I recognize that not all of us want to reproduce, but for some of us, we see this as one of the most important things we ever will do or ever did. To bring humanity forward, we have to reproduce. So generally, when a couple announces that they are expecting a child, this is something that is almost always met with joy and celebration. There are of course some exceptions to this, such as when the expected quality of the child's life will almost certainly be bad. When a couple who knows this makes a decision to bring into existence a child anyways, they may indeed be judged for that decision. To give some examples, think of when a child is born in extreme poverty. If a couple knows that they cannot take proper care of the child and still chooses to have a child, it's probably uncontroversial to say that this is a bad decision, that they should not have done that, at least not in the situation they were in. But under average circumstances, we almost always see a couple announcing that they're expecting a child as something that is very positive, something worthy of celebration. After all, how could bringing a child into the world in good circumstances, raising it in a good way, not be an amazing thing? To answer this question, meet the philosophy called Anti-Natalism. This view holds that what I just described is not an amazing thing at all. Instead, it is rather gruesome. Or at the very least, it is always worse to bring a child into being than to not bring it into being. But how can something like that be true? On its face, this view may be brushed off to the side as ridiculous or absurd. Because after all, most of our deepest rooted intuitions scream the complete opposite of what this view suggests. But if this is your reaction, then let me tell you, you're certainly making a mistake. That is not to say that this view is necessarily correct, but this view does have some very good arguments for it that are not that easy to refute when you really consider them. The most popular defense of anti-natalism was done by David Benatar, a South African philosopher who in 2006 released his book called Better Never to Have Been. Throughout this video, my primary focus will be on David Benatar's work and arguments because he is without a doubt the most influential proponent of anti-natalism, and he may be the source for anybody who calls himself an anti-natalist today. I will be taking a look at his most important arguments, the objections that exist against them, and what the consequences are of accepting anti-natalism. In this way, I hope I'll be able to give you a decent understanding of the philosophy and why you should or shouldn't accept it. My name is Haroon. Thank you so much for watching my channel, The Pond. Part 1. Coming into existence is always a harm. It is moral to willingly have children. This is the premise that you must accept to be an anti-natalist. Now, even if you're not an anti-natalist, that doesn't mean that you cannot accept that it is at least sometimes immoral to have children. Such as in the example I gave earlier, we can think of some situations where it would be better not to create children, at least not in that time and place. I think this is something that is uncontroversial and is probably accepted by most people. That is to say, I think most would accept that there are some situations that a child that is born is now worse off than they would have been if they weren't born. Because if they hadn't been born, they would have never suffered and will never suffer. The way Benatar puts this is, somebody is harmed by coming into existence. Now, you may be a bit suspicious of a statement like that. I certainly am. How can somebody be harmed if they don't yet exist? We're essentially talking about harming a person who is not there. We're saying that the event of somebody coming into existence is a harm to them. Well, who's them? There is nobody to speak of. Yet. Now, I think many of these problems often come down to the language we use to describe them. In this way, it sounds a bit absurd, but we can rephrase this to essentially convey the same message, but avoid the absurdity. The way we were just talking about it is comparing one person to another person. So the problem is that one person exists while the other person does not exist. This other person then really is not a person at all, because there is nobody there. So we're just comparing something to nothing, essentially. But to solve this issue, what we can do is look at two situations instead. We can look at one situation, we call this situation A, and we can compare this to situation B. In situation A person exists, and in situation B, a person does not exist. The difference is, these situations are both very real. There is no problem of one not existing. A situation in which a hypothetical person doesn't exist is a real situation that we can conceive of. Now, if we have some kind of moral framework, we can look at these two situations and make value statements about them. We can say that, for example, situation A is better than situation B. Again, the situation in which the person exists versus the situation in which the person doesn't exist. If we know that in situation A, where the person exists, this person is living a happy life, we could then say that situation A is better than B. And we can also turn this around. We could say that B is better than A if we know that in situation A, where the person exists, this person is living an unhappy life. Whether you agree with these conclusions is a different matter. It doesn't really matter to explain this point. I'm just saying, no matter what your actual conclusion is about these situations and which is better, we have two real situations that we can compare in the way we like. But if you agree with the example I just gave, where situation A would be better than B, as long as the person who exists in A is a happy one, then you are at odds with the anti-natalist philosophy. Because anti-natalism holds that even if the person who exists is living a happy life, this situation is not better than B. Now, to be fair, strictly speaking, to be an anti-natalist, you don't have to hold this view that situation A, even if the person is happy, is still worse or still not better than situation B. Strictly speaking, to be an anti-natalist, all you have to do is say that it is immoral to bring children on Earth. In real life, you cannot look into the future. So, an anti-natalist could say, well, I don't know if a person is gonna have a happy or bad life, so that's why I think it's immoral to have children. There may be some anti-natalists that would say, yes, I agree, that if we know the person is gonna be happy, then it's okay, then we can bring them into existence. But because we don't know this, it is still immoral to do in real life. But for the sake of this video, as I mentioned earlier, I will be talking mainly about David Benatar's version of this philosophy. So let's get into it. How can a situation in which a person exists who is happy still not be better than a situation where nobody exists? Or be worse even? This is where Benatar's most important or most notable argument comes in. The asymmetry between pleasure and pain. Before we get into explaining the asymmetry itself, it's worth clearing up some terms first to avoid any confusion. When Benatar uses these words, such as pleasure and pain, he's using them in a very broad sense. He means that whenever we speak of pleasure, we speak of any positive experience, such as eating a food you like. This is a form of pleasure, but also the day of your wedding is a form of pleasure. Similarly, when he speaks of pain, he's just talking about every negative experience. Stubbing your toe against the wall is a form of pain. Also, losing a loved one very close to you is a form of pain. These are just two very broad, very big boxes in which all negative experiences and all positive experiences can be stored. With this cleared up, let's take a look at the asymmetry. Again, let's compare two scenarios. Scenario A person exists. The presence of their pain is bad. In scenario B, a person does not exist. The absence of any pain is good. Up till here is still symmetrical. Both are just the opposite of each other. There is no asymmetry here. But now let's take a look at the following. In situation A, where the person exists, the presence of pleasure is a good thing. But in situation B, where the person does not exist, the absence of any pleasure is not bad. This is where the symmetry gets broken. So you may wonder, why does David Benatar call this not bad? Shouldn't it be bad? If the presence of pleasure is good, the absence of pleasure surely must be bad. In the same way that the presence of pain is bad, but the absence of pain is good. Well, here's where it gets interesting. The presence of pleasure is only good if there is somebody there who needs this pleasure, who desires this pleasure. If there is nobody who desires any pleasure, what good is the presence of pleasure? Does it really matter if there's an absence of pleasure when there's nobody there to enjoy it? I think if you consider this for a moment, you'll probably come to the same conclusion that the absence of any pleasure, if there's nobody there who needs any pleasure, there literally exists nobody, then this is just neutral. There is nothing good or bad about it. I would call it neutral, but David Benatar calls it not bad. Essentially, it's the same thing. But now you may want to say, hold on, if the absence of any pleasure is just neutral, then the presence of pleasure in situation A is surely still better, because now we have a neutral thing and we have a good thing. Surely the good thing is still better than the neutral thing. This is a very intuitive conclusion, but not so fast. As we just said, in situation B, or scenario B, there is nobody there to enjoy this pleasure that is absent. And to see why this may not really be a disadvantage over situation A, let's take a look at this analogy. Let's look at two people who we call sick and healthy. Sick is somebody who regularly gets sick. But fortunately for him, he also has the ability to recover very quickly. So anytime he gets sick, he can be sure that soon he'll be better. Healthy doesn't have this ability to get better. If she were to get sick, there's nothing she can do. But fortunately for Healthy, she never gets sick. She's always in perfect health. Now surely we can all agree that Sick's ability to get better is something that is good for Sick. If Sick lacked this ability, his life would be much worse. Healthy completely lacks his ability to get better, but Healthy's always in perfect health. She doesn't need his ability to get better at all. So even though Sick has something that is good for Sick, and Healthy doesn't have that thing, can we really say that Sick has an advantage over Healthy? Sick has a good thing, but it's only good insofar as he needs it. So yes, we would call the fact that she doesn't have this ability neutral, and the fact that Sick has this ability good. Still, even though we have one good and one neutral, is this good for Sick really better than a neutral for Healthy? I don't think so. What's better about it? So to bring this back to our original asymmetry, on the one hand, we have somebody who has a desire for pleasure and has it, which is good for them. On the other hand, we have nobody, and no desire for pleasure and no pleasure. Now, if you're not convinced and you still think that the absent pleasures are a bad thing, you would indeed restore the symmetry again. But let me show you why holding this view may lead to more absurdities. If you were to say that absent pleasure, even if there's nobody there who needs that pleasure, is a bad thing, think of the amount of beings you would have to feel bad for. Ask yourself, how much pleasure does not exist or does not yet exist? If we want to put a number on it, it is essentially infinite. There exists or doesn't exist an infinite amount of hypothetical pleasure. Do you feel bad about all the Martians that don't exist and as such don't have any pleasure? All the space beings who are not floating around? And what about the unicorns on Earth that aren't real? I don't think there's anybody who should feel sorry for any of these hypothetical beings and this hypothetical pleasure that doesn't exist. So I think with these considerations in mind, David Benatar's asymmetry is pretty hard to debunk. It's pretty powerful. I, for one, don't seem to be able to show what's wrong with it. Though there is just one thing that I have maybe some problems with, and that is that he calls the absence of pain in situation B good rather than neutral. Yes, the absence of pain is better than the presence of pain, but is it really a good thing in and of itself? I don't really think so. To show why, I've come up with the following analogy. Imagine, again, two scenarios. One in which we have a room that is completely empty with no people in it. The other room, we have a person who is being actively tortured. Now, we can surely all agree that the first room or the first scenario is better than the second scenario. The first scenario has no people and no pain. The second scenario has one person and that person is going through a lot of pain. But can we say about the empty room that the empty room is good in and of itself? To bring this back to the scale of anti-natalism, exchange the word room for universe instead. Can we say that a universe with no beings in it and thus no pain is good in and of itself? Sure, it's better than a universe that's filled with torture, but it's not really good per se. But I should now say that even if I'm correct to make this objection, it's still true that the asymmetry holds. Situation B would still be preferable over situation A, because the absence of pain would still obviously be better than the lack of pain, but the absence of pleasure would not be worse than the presence of pleasure. So if you accept this asymmetry, then you accept half of David Benatar's anti-natalist argument. This first half being, it's always a harm to come into existence. But the thing is, even if you accept this statement, it's always a harm to come into existence as a result of accepting the asymmetry, it still doesn't really mean that much on its own. The whole thing with the asymmetry is all still a bit technical. Yes, somebody is technically harmed because the pleasure in life can never be a benefit over the lack of pleasure if somebody doesn't exist. But what implications does it really have? Because of some technicality, we should all stop procreating, really? So the asymmetry alone isn't really enough to establish anti-natalism. Most people are quite happy to be alive, after all. Most people don't think that they're living a life of pain. Most people don't want to die. Which makes it really hard to see that if we would bring new children into the world, that this is some great harm to them. So to really establish anti-natalism, we need to make it a bit stronger. Not only do we need to show that coming into existence is always a harm, but we also have to show that it is a very serious harm. So here is where David Benatar's second part of his arguments come in. Not only is coming into existence always worse than not coming into existence, it is quite a lot worse. It is very bad. Part 2. Just how bad is coming into existence? Pretty bad. That's David Benatar's answer to this question, and most anti-natalists' answer to this question. How does he reach this conclusion? Well, he does so in multiple ways. The first one is by suggesting that people think their quality of life is actually much better than what it really is. He attempts to show this difference between subjective assessments of our quality of life with objective assessments in quality of life by looking at 3 psychological factors that we will quickly go over. The first is that we have a tendency to remember things of the past as more rosy than how they actually occurred. We tend to filter out positive memories and cling on to those rather than negative ones. When people are asked to recall events of the past, they list a far greater number of positive things than negative things. This behavior is known as the Pollyanna principle, or Pollyannism. Most people also describe themselves as happier than the average person, which of course can't be the case, because then the average would just be higher than it is. So in other words, we have a built-in bias towards positivism. Another psychological phenomenon that may show the unreliableness of our own assessments about our quality of life is what can be called adaptation. When somebody's quality of life goes down due to some bad thing happening in their lives, at first there tends to be a large dissatisfaction. But after a while, people tend to adapt to their new circumstances, and their level of happiness or their level of self-reported quality of life goes back to the same or close to the same as what it was before. Finally, Benatar talks about comparison, about how people often assess their quality of life by comparing it to other people's lives. So rather than having an objective assessment of how high their quality of life is, it is a comparative assessment. If everybody has a very bad life and yours is slightly better than the rest, you may be mistaken to think that your life is actually of good quality, when it's just bad but slightly better than the others. Now, I know I just made a large number of claims. I have presented these with no evidence. And I will say that for the purpose of this video, I will not be going into the research behind these psychological factors. What I would rather talk about now though is, let's just assume that all these phenomena are indeed real, which I don't really have a reason to doubt that they are. There seems to be plenty of research behind them and consensus. So granting that this information is accurate, we should ask ourselves the question, so what? What does this really matter? Let's imagine that we were to measure somebody's objective quality of life, and we find that compared to how good it possibly could be, it is on the lower side of things. Benatar would argue that this is a bad life, or at least a not very good life. And if the person who lives this life is convinced that they are happy, they would be making some kind of mistake. But let us think about this for a moment. We have a situation here where some kind of objective measurement gives us a result that says it's on the lower side of things. But the person who lives a life is self-reportedly happy with that. It is far from obvious to me that this objective measure is a thing we should be paying attention to. Isn't this self-assessment what we should be caring about in the first place? As far as I can tell, having a good life only matters if it makes a person happy. In the same way, having a bad life only matters in the sense that it makes a person unhappy. If having a good life didn't end up making anybody happy, then there would be no value in having a good life. So this objective measurement seems to be largely irrelevant to me. This objection I just gave remains relevant in the next part as well, where Benatar reviews 3 ways of assessing somebody's quality of life and why life is generally bad on all 3 of these ways. I could of course be mistaken about the objection I just gave. So let's go over these 3 ways in which we can objectively measure somebody's quality of life. At least in theory, of course. These 3 are hedonistic theories, desire fulfillment theories, and objective list theories. Let's take a quick look. On the hedonistic view, a life is of good quality if it is characterized by more positive experiences than negative experiences. Editor's note here, what I should have said is not the amount of positive experiences that matters, but mostly the number and significance of the positive experiences. So a better description would have been the extent to which a life is characterized by positive experiences. This makes room for both number and significance, or more positive brain states than negative brain states. Whether an experience or a brain state is positive or negative is of course subjective. Not all brain states will be perceived as positive or negative by all people. But we can still make objective assessments based on subjective experiences. If somebody has an experience that they perceive to be bad, such as holding your hand on a hot stove, it is objectively true that this person has experienced a negative experience. To give another example, ratings on, say, a movie are subjective ratings. If 5 people rate a movie 5 stars and 5 other people rate the same movie 4 stars, these are all subjective ratings, but we can still say that it is objectively true that the average rating on this film was 4.5 stars. In the same way, we can make objective assessments on subjective experiences. So, we can look at the number and significance of all the positive experiences somebody has had, and compare these to the number and significance of all the negative experiences somebody has had. The balance between the two of them is the objective quality of life on this view. Whether or not this is a good way to establish quality of life is a different matter, but at least this is one way in which we can make an attempt to do so. The desire fulfillment view is quite similar to the hedonistic view, though there are some differences. On this view, the quality of a life is good to the extent that the desires that a person has in their life are fulfilled. Again, this can be a combination of the number of desires and the significance of the desires. I should say that, of course, just the same as with the hedonistic view, to do this in practice with a real person would be quite difficult because we would need access to all their experiences in their life to make this assessment. But the point is that, at least in theory, if we did know all of the experiences somebody went through, or all of the desires somebody had and which ones of those were fulfilled, it's easy to imagine that, at least in theory, if we had all the relevant information, we could apply some kind of calculus to figure out the objective quality of their life. The objective list view is a bit different from the previous two. On this view, the quality of the life can be assessed by looking at how much it is characterized by objective goods, irrespective of whether or not these goods have an influence on one's desire fulfillment or their mental states. One objective list can, of course, differ from another objective list. What the correct list is will depend on who you ask. But just like the others, at least this is a framework by which we could assess one's quality of life in an objective manner. Again, at least in theory, if we would know all the relevant information about a person. David argues that life tends to be bad on all of these three views. On hedonism, a life is good or bad depending on the negative and positive experiences somebody goes through within their life. As for positive experiences, think of things such as eating food that you like, listening to your favorite song, hugging a person that you love, looking out at a wonderful view, and so on. Negative experiences would be feelings like guilt, shame, anxiety, physical pain, and so forth. He argues that for the psychological reasons we went over earlier, we tend to ignore just how much our life is characterized by these negative emotions. Or I should say negative mental states. Even if these are only mildly negative mental states, there are many minor discomforts that happen to us multiple times a day. Think of hunger, thirst, bowel and bladder distension as these organs become filled, tiredness, stress, thermal discomfort and itch. Benatar acknowledges that there are pleasures to be had in relieving displeasures. Eating food to get rid of hunger is a pleasure, as well as drinking when you're thirsty, scratching when you have an itch, and so on. But he doesn't seem to find much significance in these pleasures. It's not really obvious to me that these pleasures aren't good enough in and of itself to be worth to have some discomfort for. Would you really never want to be hungry again if it means giving up the pleasure of eating when you are hungry? I think most of us will agree that eating when you're particularly hungry is a pleasure that is not really insignificant. I personally don't think it would be a good idea of me to trade away this sensation of eating when I'm hungry just to never be hungry again. David argues that people generally have a strong bias towards the positive, and while this may indeed be true, I'm not really convinced, or I should say, I am pretty convinced that Benatar also has an irrational bias towards the negative, at least when he's speaking of these things. I should add though, there is one very significant consideration in this line of thinking that I chose not to talk about yet, but we will get into this later. The desire fulfillment view is quite similar to the hedonistic view. There is some significant overlap between the two. Namely, that one can have a desire to have positive mental states, and often does. On hedonism, experiencing negative mental states is bad, while on the desire fulfillment view, having unfulfilled desires is bad. So oftentimes, the same things are going to be true or good and bad on both views. Though there are also other desires that, at least on the surface level, don't seem to be clearly linked to positive or negative mental states. Here too, David argues that most of us are looking at the situation far too optimistically. Most desires that we have are not fulfilled immediately. there is usually a period of frustration between having the desire and the fulfilling of the desire, if it gets fulfilled at all in the first place. And if it does get fulfilled, the moment that we reach that point, the joy that is experienced from this is also very short-lived. After this, we need to find a new desire, which we need to fulfill, and then the cycle just repeats. And again, this really is the best case scenario. Many desires are not fulfilled at all. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Here too, I would again accuse David of doing the same thing as before. I think he has a real irrational bias towards the negative. While all I just mentioned is true, the implications of this don't have to be as dire as Benatar makes it out to be. I think being deprived of having your desire fulfilled can often be a good thing. We often enjoy the struggle of working our way upwards. I currently desire to become successful on YouTube, but I'm not sure if I would want the success if it didn't mean that I had to make YouTube videos and work for them. The fact that this costs time and effort doesn't have to be a bad thing per se. The desires I have aren't limited to reaching the end point. I also have a desire to work towards the end point. These are real desires in and of themselves that do get fulfilled every day when I'm working on the YouTube channel. David Benatar does kind of acknowledge this. Here's what he has to say about it. I concede that some people do enjoy the process of fulfilling some desires. There are surely some writers, for example, who enjoy the process of writing a poem or a book, and some gardeners may enjoy the process of growing the desired vegetables. However, it is probably the case that Pollyannaism and other psychological features cause more people either to think that they desire the process or not to mind having the desire unfulfilled during it. Again, I'm skeptical about how much this is actually a problem. If somebody is happy doing what they're doing, how can this be objectionable? What does it matter if there are psychological factors that are tricking them into being happy? Their self-reported happiness is their happiness. Even if you want to say that they're not really happy, what's really going on is that they're in some sort of illusion of happiness due to their psychology. What exactly is the difference between an illusion of happiness and actual happiness? I honestly just fail to see what's so bad about the Pollyanna principle. It's strange to me that Benatar seems so focused on this kind of objective measure of somebody's quality of life and regards subjective assessments as really unimportant. Should our end goal really be to reach some objective highest quality of life? Is it not the subjective feeling that people have about their life that really matters in the end? As I've said before, what good is a good life if somebody isn't happy because of it? In the same way, what's so bad about a bad life if the person who's living it is not unhappy because of it? To summarize, I think my main objection to Benatar's thinking here is that the end goal that he has in mind may just not be the most relevant end goal we should put to ourselves. What he regards as unreliable and seemingly unimportant may really be the most important factor that we should maximize. Coincidentally, right after writing this part of the script, I found this exact point being raised on the Christian radio show Premier Unbelievable. I will play this clip right here.
Why isn't someone's own personal assessment of their life what we should be considering anyway? What does it matter that objectively maybe their life is not as good as they think it is, as long as they enjoy and think their life is one of a certain quality that they enjoy? I'm not sure why you think the objective side of things matters for them.
I think it depends on what decision you're making. So if you're talking about an existing person who's deciding whether or not to continue their life, let's say they're suffering a terminal condition, there's unbearable suffering associated with this, and then you may get two people who go in different directions. One says, well, I'm prepared to put up with this. This is better than death. And somebody else might say, well, I'd rather be dead. Right. And I'm exactly inclined to defer to the person whose life it is, because if they're mistaken, they're going to be the person who is going to pay the price. So I don't think it's right for us to be imposing an external decision on them.
If I'm understanding him correctly here, he seems to be saying something like, when a person already exists, it's indeed not a real problem if they enjoy their life even though it's bad. But he says, this is not the position we're in as it refers to anti-natalism. As I'm editing this video, I seem to have noticed that Benatar just answered a different question than the one that was asked. He's saying that when somebody exists, it's indeed their decision to make whether or not they're willing to put up with the situation that they're in. But that we shouldn't make the decision for people, and we do this by creating children, of course. But the question that was asked is, why do objective assessments matter more than subjective assessments? And I don't think Benatar really gave an answer to this question, at least not here.
But that's not the decision we're talking about when we're speaking about procreation. Now we're deciding whether to bring a being into existence. And we can't consult that being, that's impossible. So we've got to decide for it.
What we should be asking is it okay to create a person, bring a person into existence who will have a bad life, but experience this life as a good one? And I think he gives a really good analogy for this, which is that think of slaves who actually endorse their own slavery. Would it be right to create a people of slaves if they are happy with being slaves? Wouldn't it still be wrong to enforce slavery onto them?
Now, let's imagine that you could create a slave, create a being that would be a slave to you, and you could create it in such a way that would actually endorse its enslaved condition. You know that one of the features of creating it is that it would endorse its status as a slave.
Right. So you're saying its self-assessment would be wrong.
We wouldn't just defer to self-assessment there. We wouldn't say, well, I'm going to be creating a happy slave, a contented slave, and therefore it's expected to do that, especially if there was some systematic explanation for why the slave, let's say, would have that adaptive preference.
Very interesting.
This is a pretty powerful argument and a pretty good analogy. But what we should also remember, and this is something that Benatar of all people knows best, I think, is that intuition alone cannot lead us to accept or reject arguments. Or at least it should not lead us to reject or accept arguments. While I find it very intuitive to accept that bringing into existence a slave who is happy with being a slave would still be bad, I'm still not 100% convinced that this really is the case. However bad it may sound, I'm not sure if I see what the actual problem is. I think the point I was making earlier still stands. If somebody is self-reportedly happy, is this not the only thing that matters? Is somebody in slavery really in a bad situation if they enjoy that slavery? Again, I realize this sounds bad, but I just don't know how to show that this is actually bad. I can't seem to make sense of it. But of course, you can make of this what you will. As for objective list theories, I've decided that for the sake of not making this video any longer than it needs to be, I will not be going into this. All three of these theories are ways to determine objective quality of life. He argues that all three of them show that life is generally bad. The objective list theories is not an exception to this. More or less the same conclusions are reached. With all of this being said, why don't we come back to this important consideration that I skipped over earlier. I criticize Benatar for thinking that it is this objective quality of life that we should focus on instead of the self-reported happiness. But the thing is, this criticism, even if I'm correct to make it, doesn't solve all of the issues. If you agree with my criticism, you should know that this really only tells us something about the lives that people are indeed happy to live. We haven't paid any attention yet to those lives that people are not happy to live. Unhappy lives are lived by hundreds of millions, maybe even more. There are those who live in chronic pains, those who are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, those who need to work immensely hard and are barely able to survive because of it, and those who are suicidal and depressed for any reason. Lives like these are plentiful and cannot be ignored. Not everyone is living an average life. And it should also be noted that the level of happiness in an average life is drastically different depending on where in the world we choose to look. But even for those of us who are among the luckiest, those of us who are born and raised in developed countries, in a relatively wealthy family, this in no way guarantees that you will live a happy life. No amount of love, wealth, stability prevents one from getting into a car accident and being paralyzed for the rest of their life. No amount of physical health prevents one from being sexually assaulted. If we accept the asymmetry that we discussed in the first part, we must accept that it is never a benefit for a person to come into existence. The only real benefit that comes with coming into existence is a benefit granted to other people, not the one who comes into existence. Although there surely is a benefit that is experienced by those around the one who came into existence, namely the parents, grandparents, brothers and sisters, and the future friends and colleagues. Their lives may be very positively impacted by the existence of this person. This is indeed a very real benefit. But we should realize that if we choose to procreate just because we and other people around us will benefit from it, we are essentially gambling with the quality of another person's life just to make our own better. There is no way to guarantee that your child will not experience tragedy that makes their life miserable, which is a very real possibility. The only way to guarantee this is by never having a child in the first place. This consideration makes anti-natalism a philosophy that's not very easy to refute. Part 3. The consequences of accepting anti-natalism. If everyone became convinced of anti-natalism today, an inevitable result would of course be that humanity goes extinct. It's easy to reject anti-natalism on this fact alone, but we probably shouldn't be so quick. There are a number of things we should consider before making this kind of judgment. The first thing to realize is that the question of human extinction is not so much a question of if humanity goes extinct. It is more a question of when we go extinct. That humanity will go extinct at some point is something we can say with a pretty high degree of confidence. Now, before I go on, I will admit that I am not considering religious worldviews here, in which people may receive an eternal life after death. If this is the case, then of course, humanity, albeit in a different form, will never go extinct. But for the purposes of this video though, I will be maintaining a materialistic view on the existence of humans. With this clarified, I will go on to say that even if for humans everything goes on as good as it possibly can, eventually the sun will reach the end of its lifespan and the earth will no longer be inhabitable. But even if we somehow find a way to keep living independent of the sun, the universe will also die at some point, be it by heat death or whatever may do it first. So we need to ask ourselves the question, is it really better that humanity keeps existing for longer rather than shorter? What's really better about humanity lasting another 100,000 years rather than 50,000 years? As far as I can tell, the only way to really be able to say that this is better is by saying that there is something intrinsically valuable about the existence of humans, or a property of humans such as compassion or love, or something that is only brought forth if humans exist, such as advancements in science and technology. You'd have to say that rather than these things just being a means to make the quality of our lives better, it is somehow valuable in and of itself, irrespective of whether or not there is somebody there to enjoy this value. You can take this position, but you would also of course have to reject the asymmetry we discussed earlier. You'd have to say that certain things can be good, even if there's nobody there to enjoy this good. If you remember the analogy we used, you would have to say that somehow sick has an advantage over healthy. So we need to ask ourselves a question. Is there really something to be regretted about human extinction? While answering this question with a no is about as unintuitive as it gets, it is of course true that intuition alone should not dictate what we think is true. This is not to say that the answer is definitely no. There may be something that I'm missing or haven't really considered deeply enough, but as it currently stands, I'm just not able to defend the answer yes. Finally, let's consider another question that if we were to answer this with yes, this may just be even more unintuitive than the previous question. And I would say it is definitely more unintuitive to a pretty great extent. The question, should we all commit suicide? Luckily, I suppose, Benatar's answer to this question is a pretty strong no. Now I should say that, according to Benatar, there are some situations where it is better for somebody to end their own lives. And I would say that I probably agree. I also don't think this is very controversial. It's not very difficult to imagine somebody in a position where their life is so bad and their happiness is so low that it may actually be preferable for their life to come to an end. This is a position that is not held by everyone, but I do have a feeling that most people watching this will feel similarly. The way Benatar reaches his answer no to the question we asked is that even though he doesn't believe it can ever be a benefit to come into existence, he does think that it is a real harm to stop existing once somebody already exists. This is because people usually have a pretty strong interest in existing once they exist. Most people have this interest. If somebody does die, this is something that goes against that interest of them. So, he argues this is bad for them. This is probably a very common view, but I have to say that I cannot agree with it. If we don't accept the idea of any kind of afterlife, and we just accept that after death there is no more experience to be had, then this state of being is the same as the state of being for somebody who hasn't yet been born. Death, just like not existing, is no state of experience at all, is a complete lack of any state of being. It's for this reason that I personally find it impossible to defend that there is a harm done to the person who is dead. However, there are many harms that are associated with death. While editing, I noticed that I didn't spend enough time talking about this position that I hold, and that I should elaborate on it. This position of death not being bad for the person who dies is the Epicurean position on death, and it is one that Benatar briefly considers in his book. He sums it up quite nicely here. Epicurus famously argued that death is not bad for the one who dies, because so long as one exists, one is not dead, and once death arrives, one no longer exists. Thus, my being dead, in contrast to my dying, is not something that I can experience, nor is it a condition in which I can be. Instead, it is a condition in which I am not. Accordingly, my death is not something that can be bad for me. This, however, is my position and not Benatar's position. Benatar does think that death is bad for the person who dies. Benatar does mention a few reasons for why this may be the case, but at no point does he really make a proper defense of why he holds his view. It's pretty weird to see. In an interview by Sam Harris, he was pushed on this point. And here is a cut version of how the conversation went.
That initial asymmetry, which is doing a lot of work for you.
Not as much as you think.
Yeah, the truth is I don't actually think you need it to have your view. But
No.
what you do need to have your view, and this is where your view sort of slides into the pro-mortalism for me. What you do need is to have a judgment about the character of existence that is pessimistic enough to make it seem that life really isn't worth living, not only for those who don't yet exist, but those who exist in this state of mediocrity we call a podcast. Like the two of us should really, again, leaving aside imposing misery on those who love us, we should really not just be indifferent to not waking up tomorrow. We should hope it happens. We should hope it happens for everybody in some painless way so as to be spared the certain misery that is coming our way and the possible horrific amplification of the misery that is possible that we're probably not even thinking about.
Look, the miseries I'm expecting tomorrow are not so bad that I would rather be dead. At least the ones I'm expecting. That might not be true down the line.
Okay, but David, let's just focus there. So if that's how you feel about tomorrow for you, and I hand you your newborn baby, how is it that you wouldn't feel the same sort of default optimism for the prospects of your baby enjoying tomorrow?
But that's a being that already exists. And this is why we're coming back to, I think, this fundamental disagreement between us. You keep speaking about the life that's worth living, and that does elide the difference between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. If I had a baby in front of me, I would not kill it for its sake.
You would think it would be better that it had not been born.
Better that it had not been born, but that's different to say that it's better for it to now die.
We're sort of disagreeing about just what the space provided is in order to put that difference. But
yeah, it depends on how bad death is, and you don't think it's bad if you avoid all those confounding variables. And I think that even if we avoid all of those, it is bad. But I don't think I have to adopt pro-mortalism because I'm an anti-natalist. And I think that the method for avoiding it is by saying that death is a harm to the person who dies, or is bad for the person who dies. Ways of doing that, I've spoken about annihilation. You can speak about deprivation. There's the deprivation account of death's badness. That's another way of doing it. We can argue about the merits of those different views of the badness of death, but at least on the face of it, there are arguments that death is bad, even though there is nobody who experiences that badness.
Right. I'll leave you to make of this what you will. Now, let's get back to talking about the negative things that are associated with death, rather than the negative things about death itself. Death rarely occurs without a process of dying that takes at least some amount of time. The extent of the harm that somebody experiences while in the process of dying varies, but this is usually a pretty significant harm to undergo. But something even stronger to consider is the fact that throughout our life we form relationships and bonds with other people. Even if there is no suffering in our own death, think of those who care about us, our parents, our family, friends, and so on. The harm that is caused to them as a result of our death can be incredibly significant. How much grief does a mother go through if her own child dies? How much harm is done to a child if one of their parents die? These are very powerful considerations that we should take very seriously. There is of course a lot more to say about the topic of death and suicide. Enough to deserve a dedicated video perhaps. For this video though, I think I've given enough food for thought. I think at the very least I've been able to show that if you are an anti-natalist, this doesn't mean that you have to become pro-suicide. Conclusion. Anti-natalism is a philosophy that is very depressing to a lot of people. And while I can see why this is, I honestly feel mostly fascinated by it. When I first came across this idea, I thought that it was absurd to suggest that it would be immoral to have children. I was blown away when I started to realize that this idea that seemed so outlandish at first was actually making plenty of sense. While I don't agree with Benatar on everything, I do have a lot of respect for him. He has done an amazing job at coming up with a sophisticated argument, or set of arguments, that lead to conclusions that, despite being so counterintuitive, are pretty hard to reject. So, despite the depressing nature of the topic, I had a great time learning about it. The last question that I'll talk about is one that you probably shouldn't care about at all, but I'll still answer it. Am I an anti-natalist? As is probably very typical, my answer is, it's hard to say. I wouldn't call myself an actual anti-natalist. Though I will say that after reading the arguments, I'm much closer to being an anti-natalist than I was before. But I think my actual opinion on procreation is something that I just need to spend more time thinking about, While I do lean towards the anti-natalist side, I also recognize that I can be wrong about this and that there may be some things I'm just missing. So I feel like currently I'm not in a position where I should hold a strong conviction one way or the other. What about yourself? If you weren't familiar with the philosophy before, I'm curious to find out whether this video has given you more insight into it and has changed your thoughts on procreation at all. If you are already familiar with the topic, I would definitely like to know if there's something that I left out that should be in a video like this. Either way, I would love to hear any feedback on this video. Good faith criticism will be highly appreciated. With that, if you're still here, I want to thank you so much for watching till the end. Especially as a beginning creator, this will help me so much. Please remember to always keep an open mind to new information, just not so open that your brain falls out. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video.